This is a detailed tutorial created for those who don't already have plenty of technical repair experience. For a shorter video, check out our Pro version tutorial linked in the description or by clicking the card in the upper right hand corner. You can also find timestamps for specific steps and links for tools and parts in the video description. It's a good idea to watch the whole video before you start your project, or at least preview a few minutes in advance. The first thing we want to do when performing a phone repair is to power the device down if possible. For iPhones, you will need a special screwdriver to remove these two pentalobe screws from the bottom of the phone. If you don't have these tools already, you can find links to the tools and the parts used in this tutorial down in the video description. The iPhone 8 opens up sort of like a book, but instead of right to left, it goes from left to right. And on the inside, we have two sets of cables here and here that you have to watch out for when you're prying the front off. We also have hooks that go across the top and latch in inside of the phone at the upper end. So I'll show you a shot of those shortly so you can see what they look like. Here's a photo of one of the three latches on the upper end of the phone. That inset gives you a slightly better view. They aren't particularly easy to photograph. And here is an angled view so you can kind of see how that hook works. And if you snap these off, I don't know that there's a way to replace them. And I recommend that you use heat in this process if possible. If you don't have a heat gun, you can also use a hair dryer. And what we want to do is warm up the adhesive that goes around the perimeter of the screen just to make it slightly easier to work with. You'll need a tool like this, an iCESIMO, or some other thin, strong object. A dulled razor blade works pretty well also. It just kind of depends on your preference and what you have on hand. But you're going to have to go between the screen and the frame itself. There's a very small gap to get inside of, and once you do that, we're going to prop it up, but only slightly. Remember, we have cables on the inside. We have to be very careful not to pull the screen too far out of the frame. So what I'm going to do is prop it open partially here and then switch over to something that will be a little safer to use on the inside. Now, my go-to lately has been a waterproof playing card dipped in 91% rubbing alcohol. These also make it even easier to work your way around the perimeter of the phone where all that sticky stuff is on the inside that is designed to keep the phone somewhat water resistant. Now, you will find that on the right and left hand sides, you should be able to slide through fairly easily. Again, just dip your card into some rubbing alcohol if it feels like it's sticking. The bottom's not too bad either, but you want to make sure you're not going in any further than about 2 millimeters because there are components on the inside that you can damage if you're not careful or you go in too deep. Also, when you get up here to the top, you're going to find some areas that you can't really pry through, especially at the top right hand corner. Don't worry about those. You can kind of skip over them. In fact, the upper end, I almost hesitate to have people worry about because we're going to work that kind of independently as we're pulling it away from the frame. So mainly what you're concerned with is the bottom and the right and left. And then if you can kind of get partially across the top, you'll be okay. As you can see, I hit the power button on accident. That's not a big deal, but I will go ahead and turn the phone back off before I open it up. Now, as you can see, there's a very small gap forming on the edge, and from here what I like to do is switch over to a slightly thicker pry tool. I have a guitar pick right now that is still not very thick, but it allows you to create a slightly larger gap, and then that way we can kind of get a grip on it with our hands. Now I'm going to work this edge up just a little further, and your phone hopefully will look something like this at this point. And when you get here, what you want to do is just slide the display down so that you create a gap up there at the top, and that is going to unhook those hinges that are on the inside. And from there you can kind of just slowly lift it up. You will see some residual adhesive on the inside that's kind of stuck between the frame and the display. Don't worry about that at all. On the inside there you can see those two cables I was referring to. Well, there's actually three. There's two at the bottom and one at the top. I'm going to take a heavy object and set it down to kind of rest my screen on. We don't want that thing flopping over all the way, and we need to remove a bunch of screws. So there are going to be 4 PH000 Phillips screws down here where this cover plate goes over the battery terminal and the display cables, and then we're going to use a completely different type of screwdriver when we remove a secondary plate that goes onto the cable that you see on the left hand side there. So I'm going to go ahead and get these out. Make sure you keep these in order. They are all different lengths, so if you mix them up, you can create some problems when you put the phone back together. Okay, after you got the screws out, we can go ahead and lift that plate up. And the first thing we want to do is disconnect the battery terminal. That's going to be that second little cable that's plugged in from the right-hand side. But I want to show you up close how I go about disconnecting these. Now, as you can see, there are a whole bunch of tiny little components in between these connectors. So if you reach down inside there with something blunt, like a plastic pry tool or your fingernail or anything else, and you happen to scrape one of those tiny little components right there off of the logic board, you're going to have some issues, probably with charging, possibly with something else. And you can see how thick the edge of a plastic pry tool is when we try to go down inside there. So for that reason, I recommend you get something like a precision pair of tweezers or anything that has a very, very fine tip, and make sure you can see there in comparison to my finger how small these things are. But what you want to be certain of is that you can actually see what you're doing. So if you need a magnifying glass, reading glasses, a microscope, anything that allows you to really see the details of what's going on in here, I'll point out right now the best angle, in my opinion, to go about removing this cable, because if you go in along here, you can easily cause some damage by scraping those things. So I like to kind of find an open area. Even here, that's not really a good angle. So if you look at the top left-hand corner here, we've sort of got a clearing there where there's not too much that can be damaged. I'm going to come in from right here, just go right underneath that metal plate and lift it straight up. You don't want to dig in very far. There's other stuff on the inside that you can damage. And the main thing is that we make sure that this is just disconnected. And now I'm just going to kind of pull it out of the way so you can see what that looks like on the inside. Once that's unplugged, we can be safe and certain that we're not going to have any electricity flowing through the device, and that's what we want to avoid while we're working on it. Now, if you move right over here, we'll disconnect this little piece right here, and then if you peel it back, you'll see that there's another connector that was obscured from it previously, and once you move that out of the way, you can get underneath this one and go ahead and unplug that too. So I'm going to go ahead and do this in full view, and you can see the difference without having magnification. It's a little tricky to really tell what's going on the inside there. Also, you probably want to stabilize that screen. Now on the left-hand side, we are going to use what is called a tri-lobe Y000 driver. This is a very special type of screwdriver, and I'm also going to show you a close-up on this because this is where a lot of people run into problems with iPhones from the iPhone 7 and forward, because Apple switched over to yet another proprietary screw that is very small and easy to damage because of the way that it's designed. So again, I will show you the close-up here momentarily so you can see what this thing looks like, but after you remove those two screws, you can take off that metal plate that I just moved out of the way and then go ahead and disconnect your front-facing camera assembly. Now on the front of the display down here at the bottom, we have 4 of these tri-lobe screws that need to be removed. Again, I'm going to show these up close shortly, so if you haven't worked with them before, I recommend that you wait, go further into the video and see what these look like, because it's super important that you make sure that your driver seats properly inside of the head of these screws. If not, they strip out really easily, and once that happens, it just becomes challenging to try to get them out of the phone without causing additional damage. So we're going to go ahead and take all 4 of these out, and then there will be a metal retaining plate that you can lift out of the way once that's finished, and then we'll come back and remove and transfer the home button flex cable assembly from the original screen over to the replacement. If you weren't already aware of this with iPhones from the iPhone 5S and forward, if you want to have Touch ID, you must retain the original home button that came with the phone. You can't buy an aftermarket and replace it. It is paired to the information on the logic board inside of the phone. So if you lose or damage your original Touch ID system in any way whatsoever, for the most part, with the rare exceptions, you're going to have to go to Apple to try to get that figured out. Now under the scope, this is what these screws look like, and you want to get a driver that has a flat tip on it, and that will prevent it from getting stripped out on the inside. If you try to remove these with a Phillips driver or anything else, and you end up grinding off the inside of that screw, it is going to be a very difficult task to get it out of the phone without causing additional damage. So make sure that your screwdriver is seated perfectly and the screw is actually turning. Don't force it if you run into resistance. Now down here on the bottom of the screen, I'm going to show you a close-up of what the home button flex cable connector looks like. It kind of flops around in here, although it is plugged into that secondary cable on the left-hand side. So for that reason, we want to be able to kind of brace the cable in place as we unplug it. Watch out for all of those surrounding components. If you damage anything on this home button cable, you will not have Touch ID anymore. We cannot buy an aftermarket Touch ID fingerprint sensor to install into the phone. So in other words, if you break it, that's it. You pretty much are at Apple's mercy from that point on. So what I'm going to do is hold on to one side of this connector and stabilize it while I lift it up with another pair of tweezers on the side. And you can see here how that kind of unplugs. And I will show you this at the normal view so you can get an idea of what it's more likely to look like. But again, I felt that doing this under a microscope would give people a slightly better understanding of how this works. So once you've got this thing opened, you can see it runs all the way down there to the home button, and that cable that's stuck to the white piece on the screen, that's the one that we really have to be careful about, because if you tear it even slightly, there's a good possibility you won't have home button function or Touch ID anymore. Now I'm taking my waterproof playing card dipped in rubbing alcohol again, and I'm just going to very gently pry underneath this cable. Whatever you do, make sure you don't cut through it. I'm just going underneath it and lifting as I go. If you need to apply some heat, you might find it to be helpful as far as getting this thing to release. That adhesive under there, the first time you remove these, is kind of sticky. So again, this is kind of how I went about it. Without using the microscope, is to stabilize that cable on the bottom with one pair of tweezers, again being very careful not to put pressure on any of those components or try to stay away from them in general. Stabilize that, take another pair of tweezers and lift it up. Now I know this seems like a lot, but I have seen these things get damaged more than once when people were careless or didn't really understand what it was they were doing on this point. So this is really probably one of the easier things that can go bad if you're not careful about them. So here's another shot of the playing card, and you'll see here that as I started prying on this particular phone, it was pretty sticky. That piece of adhesive, the very first time it's been released, or the very first time you work on it, it's got some pretty decent strength to it. And here's the other thing, if you're working with a phone that has been repaired before, if that adhesive is weaker than it should be, when you go to lift it up, you can end up tearing that other cable that goes up behind the metal panel on the screen, which isn't as big of a deal as the Touch ID, of course, but if you want to send this screen in for some sort of rebate or to a refurbishing company, if the LCD is still good, you want to make sure you don't damage anything that you don't need to. So here you can see that I am applying some heat. I'm using my playing card with rubbing alcohol and just kind of taking my time. And once you get past that one little bit of adhesive underneath there, the home button will slip out from the front of the display. So whatever you do, don't try to pull it out towards you into the back, but instead make sure that it goes out through the front. And there's that piece. If your replacement part does not include the big metal panel that goes behind the LCD, you'll have to remove these 6 additional screws and transfer it over. Notice that 5 of them are Y000 and the one at the bottom right hand corner shown here is Phillips. Now I like to transfer these over as soon as possible just to avoid having anything else possibly go wrong. So we're just going to feed it up through the front of the display. We need to move this small cable out of the way and then tuck our cable underneath it. There's a small peg on the display that pokes through that little hole in the cable, and that will help you make sure that you get everything aligned properly. And once you do, you can go ahead and snap it back in. All right, so we are connected, and the next thing we're going to do is replace the retaining panel that goes behind that lower half of the screen. So when you put these 4 screws back in, all I can say is don't get too crazy with tightening them down. Try to remember how much resistance you experienced when you removed them, and when you get to the one that goes behind the home button, you have to be careful not to over tighten it, but you don't want it so loose that it unscrews itself over time. So there's really kind of a happy medium there. And if you put the phone together and your home button doesn't seem to be functioning properly, sometimes you can go back in and just reverse that screw a quarter of a turn or so. If you've got it too tight, you're going to run into problems, and occasionally you can fix that problem just by loosening it up a bit. Our next step is going to be to remove the front-facing camera assembly. So we're going to have 5 screws up here that need to come out. These are all PH000 Phillips, and I should note that some brands of screwdrivers run slightly different than others. So if it doesn't feel like your screwdriver is seating properly, you may need to switch over to a different size. Most of the time you're going to be using a PH000. On occasion I've run into screwdrivers that are PH00 that actually work with iPhone. So it really kind of depends on the brand and the manufacturer for the most part. Again, make sure that you keep all these screws in order. They are different sizes, and if you try to put the wrong screw into the wrong hole, you can have some problems. Once you get the screws out, you can go ahead and lift that little metal retaining panel off. Take your front-facing camera, fold it over to the left-hand side, and then you can remove the earpiece speaker. There's nothing really holding it in there other than the screws, and those little gold coils that you see, those match up with the gold plates on the flexible cable, and that's how information is transferred to the speaker. So when we put this back together, we want to make sure that those are matching up and that those coils don't get damaged. And from here, you're going to have pretty much a lot of adhesive underneath this cable. Now, all of this stuff that's on this piece is connected, so you have to be very careful. I might even consider using the playing card again, but you need something small to get underneath this cable and pry it away from the frame without putting any stress on it. So if you tear this thing even a tiny bit, chances are you're going to have to replace it. And I'm probably going to have to make a tutorial video for that later on, because that can kind of be a pain also. So just take your time, apply some heat if you find that to be helpful, and we're just going to pry behind this cable from either side. So from here, you want to get underneath the thick part, and do keep in mind that it's connected to everything, including those 4 little gold coils that you see. So if you pull too hard on one piece while another part of it is still stuck down, it is really easy to tear these. So just take your time, work through slowly, and again, if your eyes are like mine, you probably should have some magnification. If you have great up close vision, then that's great for you, and I hope that you can see all the details of what you're working on, because that's really going to make the difference as to whether anything gets damaged when you're removing this, in addition to how gentle you are with it. Now, I was pointing out a small black piece of adhesive tape there on the left-hand side at this point, and we're going to come back and remove that because we need some double stick tape just like this piece to be transferred over from the original screen to the replacement. And if you see anything missing on your replacement screen, you want to make sure you transfer those components over too. Now, this part of the cable I wanted to show you up close because there are 2 little pieces that kind of wrap around. I've got them pointed out with the arrows here. So you have to make sure those things stay folded the way that they are now and don't fly out to the sides, because that's not the proper position. Here's another picture where you can see I'm pointing out the proximity sensor on the bottom, and that little rectangle has to fit into the plastic piece that is pointed out underneath the arrow on the top when we put this thing back in. If you don't do that, your phone's not going to function properly. So when we go to put it back in, you should be able to reuse the existing heat adhesive that's already on the cable. If you find that it's not sticking down properly, you may need to replace it. You can use something like 3M or red tape adhesive. I'll again have links to all these supplies down in the video description, but we want to set this thing down, get those little 2 pieces tucked inside, and make sure that everything is laying down flush the way it was when we originally took it off of the old screen. When you have it in that position, you can go ahead and lay the speaker back down on top of the cable. Use the two holes down at the bottom of the plastic to align it on either side. That way you'll know that it's centered properly. And once you get it into place, then comes the really tricky part, and that is getting the front-facing camera wrapped over the back of the speaker into the dust cover, which is the little plastic round piece that's on the screen itself. And from there, you have to just kind of hold everything in place, not allow it to shift, and get the metal retaining plate back onto the speaker. So this right here is the maneuver. Just getting that into place without letting anything move, because if it does, you put the phone together, if you don't have any sound on your earpiece, or your screen doesn't shut off when you make a phone call, you probably did something wrong or you missed something at this step. So that would be the place to look if you end up with any problems. Once we have this all into position, you can go ahead and replace all 5 of the screws that we took out. Again, remember to put them in their respective holes. If not, I've seen things as bad as pushing a screw all the way through the screen on the other side and pretty much ruining the replacement part. So we want to be absolutely certain that we get these screws back into the right spot. All right, now that we have all our screws installed, here's the fun part. We need to remove the old adhesive that came off from the waterproofing installed in the phone. I mean, that is, of course, if you want your phone to be water resistant like it was before you replaced the screen. This is the easiest method I've found, is just kind of pushing your finger along the side, and be very careful. You don't want to snag anything. Obviously, there are some sensitive components in the phone, so make sure you don't come into contact with anything other than the frame and the adhesive that you're rolling off. If you catch something else in there, you can have some problems, obviously. So just work your way around. We want to have a nice clean surface before we apply the new adhesive, and we'll get to that step in just a moment. All right, so you're going to grab the largest tab on your adhesive here. If you look down on the right hand corner, and very slowly, very carefully remove this. Try not to touch any of the sticky part that's around the edges, and hopefully this all comes off clean. I recommend you buy a couple of these. A lot of times they don't sit just perfectly, and it does take some practice to get them installed and to get them centered. And once you stick this down, you can't pull it back off because it stretches out the adhesive, and then you pretty much lose the shape of it. You can see I got just the edge on there, and in this particular case I was lucky enough that it would still come off without damaging the adhesive itself, but usually that's not the case. So you really want to get this right on the first shot, or at least have a backup plan, like a few spares just in case. Now we want to make sure this thing is perfectly centered and lay it down with this template on the inside of the frame. Alright, so it looks like we've got that centered properly. I'm just going to go around the edges and push it down so that it sticks to the frame. Sometimes the adhesive likes to stick to the plastic, and we really don't want that to happen. We need it to stay in position. Now there are 2 additional layers on this. One is going to be the centerpiece that you see, and then there's a small thin strip that goes around the perimeter of the phone. If you grab this tab right here, and again very carefully pull this away, it should leave you with adhesive that has a plastic backing around the inside. So this way, when we get this centerpiece removed, there's really nothing sticky just yet. All the sticky stuff is up against the frame on the inside, and you shouldn't have to worry as you're working with the phone itself when you install it. And make sure that small strip doesn't come off, obviously, at this point. We're going to leave that on there for later on, all the way around this outside, and then right before we get ready for the final installation, we'll go ahead and pull that off. In the meantime, we need to go ahead and get our screen installed, and once you plug everything in and put the retaining panels back on, you might want to turn the screen on, test it, and make sure everything's working properly before you pull off that strip of adhesive, because once you do and you stick this panel on, if you take it off, obviously we have to go through that whole process again. So this is the best angle that in my opinion anyways, as far as connecting the upper portion of the phone, that front-facing camera assembly. If you plug that in first, it should make your life a lot easier, because at that point we can kind of turn the phone around, move the screen over, and then plug in those 2 additional cables. And of course, the last thing we're going to connect will be the battery. So make sure that you don't plug that in until all of these are connected. We don't want to have any current flowing through the phone or accidentally hitting the power button while we're plugging these cables in. So just like anything that you work on in electronics, you typically don't want any power source connected while you're removing or installing the cables. These can be tricky to align, so once again, if you have magnification, I recommend that you use it, but the one thing you want to resist is the temptation to force these cables into their connectors, because if you do, if they're not aligned properly, it's very easy to bend them or to damage something on the phone itself. And once you do that, your problems have become much more complicated. All right, so we've got everything plugged in, and now all we have to do is replace the retaining panels. I find these tweezers come in very handy for getting these things into the right position. I almost put that on the wrong way. All right, so let's go ahead and put this panel behind the front-facing camera connector. And remember that we have a special screwdriver that we're using for these screws. You do not want to try to put a crosshair screwdriver down inside here. Also, be careful not to cross thread these. If they start to go in sideways, make sure you reverse them until you've got the thread just outside of where it starts. And you can usually feel or hear an audible click when you're reversing a screw when the thread goes off of the very first part of the barrel that it goes into. So if you start to cross thread and you back it out, you can usually get it to align back to where it's supposed to be. And for some reason, I had my SIM card out of this phone, or my SIM card tray rather. All right, so I just connected the battery, and now we're going to put that cover plate back on top. Just remember to reconnect the battery before you install this piece. And look at this, we have a slightly bent clip up here at the top of the screen, so I'm going to go ahead and straighten that out. It's obviously not going to do us any good if it's bent over to the side like that. All right, we've got everything plugged in and screwed down. Our next step is to remove this last little piece of plastic that goes around the edges. You have to be careful with this, take your time. It does like to stick to the adhesive and try to pull it off the frame, so just go slowly, and if you peel to the side, it seems like it usually comes off a bit cleaner, but there's not really an easy way to do it. All I can say is just go slow and hope that everything sticks down, and you can always put some pressure on it before you peel it off. Sometimes that helps it to stick to the frame, and if you clean the frame off beforehand, you shouldn't have any trouble for the most part. When I got to this corner, it was a bit sticky, so again, just take your time and watch out for these areas where it doesn't want to come off. Now remember, we have some clips at the top that need to go in first before we close the phone up, so that should be the main concern here, is that these clips get latched around those little plastic tabs on the inside from the top, and then once they do, you can kind of work your way around the rest of the phone. So you'll see I've got a gap here. I'm going to push that down and in and then up towards the top. And when that's sitting flush with the frame, we can proceed to putting the rest of the phone together. So from here, I'm just going to work my way around the edges and push everything in until it's nice and flush. And now we've got this thing pretty close to factory specs for the most part, as far as the water resistance goes. I'm going to go ahead and power it up for this last part, and that is to replace the 2 screws on the bottom. Remember, we need to put those back in, and from there, you are just about ready to go. I do recommend that you test out the touchscreen front and rear facing cameras, volume controls, make a phone call, check your speaker and so forth, and just make sure that everything is working 100% as soon as possible. And that is it. If you found the video helpful, hit the like button, share, subscribe, and use the bell notification icon if you want to be alerted when new videos are available. If there's something that I can do in the future to make tutorials more helpful, leave your suggestions in the comment section or join us on the next Phone Tech Hangout live stream. Thanks for watching.